Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Hill, and I'm chairman of the Ulster Beekeepers Association. And I'd like to bid you a very warm welcome to the first of our spring webinars. The reason for the webinars is that unfortunately we are unable to hold our normal annual conference, which last couple of years has taken place in February. It's one of the first events, bee events of the season. But unfortunately, the pandemic has put pay to that. So we're running the spring webinars instead. And I am absolutely delighted that our first speaker is Mr. Jed Marshall, who is a bee farmer in Buckinghamshire in England, and has been a very prominent bee farmer for many, many years. He in fact has a farm in which he has about 135 hives, which is actually greatly reduced from what he used to have. But in fact, with very judicious beekeeping, he is able to harvest as much honey from the 135 hives as he did with many, many more. He is also a very prominent queen producer, producing upwards of maybe a couple of thousand queens per year, and has been a prominent member of the Bee Farmers Association, having chaired it, in fact, a few years ago. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Jed, who will start his presentation. Jed.
Yes, bear with me while I load this screen, please. All right, John, can you see the screen you were hoping to see?
I can see the screen, but that's the screen. Yes, we're seeing exactly the one we're looking for.
Great. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I'd like to say back, because I do enjoy coming over the water to visiting you all. But we have to make do with the Zoom. This talk is about the New Year management, basically from New Year through to when the honeys start coming in. That's how I'm defining it. You could call it spring or late winter management. I'll give a little bit of background, adding to what John has already said. We started bee farming full-time in the late 80s and were fortunate enough to buy a greenfield site just down the road. So we took the address with us and moved down the road and set up a honey farm without any neighbours. This sums up what we're doing now. John's covered a bit of it. We're now got 120 honey production hives and 700 mini nukes for the queen rearing. We do average the 2,000 queens a year from the queens. Honey wise, we always expected to average 10 tons from the 200, 250 hives we had. We did have an exceptional year in 2019, and we averaged £200 per hive from the 135 hives that John mentioned. We'd only got 7.5 tons this last season, but that was our second best per hive year ever. Of that, we pack about 20% of it and sell it locally through local shops. Most of it either goes to the big packers, Rouse, who supply the supermarkets, or to other beekeepers, usually ones who are either part-time bee farmers or large-scale hobby beekeepers who've got really good outlets but not the ability to have more bees or produce more honey, so they supplement their production by buying in from us. The map on the right, yes, it will be your right, shows roughly where we live, which is halfway between Oxford and Milton Keynes in a little village called Steeple Claydon. And the arrows show that we move hives. When we're full-time honey production, some hives would move 7 times a year. Would go down to Kent in the spring, early on, late March, early April, to cherries and plums, move on to pears, and then move those, as well as bringing more hives down to the apples, usually late April, and bring them all home end of May. Anything that wasn't in the orchards was near to home, sitting on oilseed rape, which is more difficult to find these days because of the ban on neonics and farmers not being able to grow the rape successfully. And then historically, we used to go up north to the heather, but more recently, borage came on the scene. Great honey, late summer, and if everything goes right, you get a fantastic crop from it. And we'd move bees. We've been to Yorkshire, Kent, Wales, all over our local area for well, south of England for borage. But in the last couple of years, one of our local estates has started growing echium, which is very similar, still produces a seed that they extract the gamma-linolenic acid for homeopathic remedies. So that's right on our doorstep, made the moving a lot easier for us. I run it with my wife, Sheila, who does the honey deliveries and used to sort out the queen orders and things. What we've done recently is we've handed over the queen rearing to my daughter-in-law, Rika, who's going to run the queen rearing from now on with her husband, Tim. I'm going to assist a bit or interfere, depending on how you describe it. And she's going to do that side, and I'll stick with the honey production. Our daughter, who'd worked with me for many years and was the first bee farmer apprentice, went off to New Zealand October before last and is still stuck out there in that if she leaves New Zealand now, because of their status of being COVID free, they won't let her back in. And she's got a boyfriend out there and wants to spend the winters there anyway. So she's still out there, and hopefully we will see her sometime. Both we and her are getting a bit disappointed as she's getting very homesick, but I don't think she'd really enjoy coming home and just sitting doing nothing. Anyway, let's get on with tonight's talk. There'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. There is a box somewhere, if you search your screen, where you can actually ask questions, put them in. John will manage that, and at the end, we'll go through them for everybody. Right, the big thing with this New Year management, it's the first bit of it I've usually done very late summer, early autumn. I put the bees on a well-sheltered site close to sources of pollen. Usually they're sheltered from the wind on three sides, north, east and west, so they get all the sun with not too much cold winds, hopefully. Here are some of them. This is one. It's a nice semicircle of woodland in the middle of woodland, nicely sheltered. It's on a reasonable rise, so it doesn't get too damp, and the hives are tucked away there. On the colder days in winter, you can easily go around, and there's not too much to do anyway on the honey farm. We'll go around and have a tidy up of the sites. Good time to get the strimmer out and so on. And so long as you don't bang the hives and it's a reasonably cold day, you don't have to worry about bee protection. You just need wellies or something for all the brambles and nettles. We can get on with tidying the sites up. Here's another one, corner of a field, reasonably easy access during the summer. Unfortunately, there is a very soggy dip that at the moment I'm actually just walking through it because all I'm doing is checking there's nothing detrimental happened to the hives. And also, because technically it's going to work for me, I can still do it under lockdown, and it gets me a bit of freedom from sitting at home. So here we go. This is one of the first jobs we can do at this time of year. When my daughter was doing the apprenticeship scheme, they'd meet up twice a year, and one of the questions the supervisor was asking was, well, what do you do over winter? Beck said, oh, it's great. Dad and I go out in the truck, we drive round and we just look at the hives and see which ones have got the snow melted on them. And then we go home, which was not quite the comprehensive answer the supervisor was expecting. But it is sort of what we do, in that here you can see the snow's melted on this hive, and here and there. We don't have ventilated floors, so we don't seal the hives up at the top, in that the crown boards have the holes open and exposed in them, and there's no insulation under there. my personal feeling on this is bees suffer more from damp over winter than from being too cold. Yes, if they're cold, it'll slow the development in the spring, but dampness will actually cause problems health-wise and disease-wise, which is a far bigger concern to me than getting them started early, which I think I can do adequately anyway with other things that I'll mention shortly. So we do go around, and especially this time of year, this is exactly this time of year, frosty or snowy morning. Here's a frosty morning, tiny bit of snow again. The snow started melting. This means the hive, the colony there has got the hive up to brood rearing temperature, which is just around our body temperature. In the center of that hive, it will be at our body temperature, give or take a few degrees. And consequently, the snow melts. And that is because the queen started laying. If the queen hasn't started laying, they don't need to get the hive up to temperature. And you'll see the roofs still covered in snow. This one, there, it's got offset holes and it's just started melting there. And that is really reassuring. We don't do much else at this time of year. It's usually a little bit later on. Right, and a little bit later on, if in doubt, we'll take the roofs off. Now, this is 1 yard. Just taking the roofs off and having a quick peek in the hives. And there were over 30 queen wasps hibernating round the edge of the crown board on this one hive, which I disposed of, most of them, before I had enough gumption to get my camera out and photograph it so I could add it to this talk. But the surprising thing was very few of the other hives had any wasps hibernating round them at all. All similar design, so there was access, but they all chose this one hive. It's an ideal place because, especially with my hives not insulated, there's a bit of warmth there. It's obviously dry, so it works well for the wasps. So do look out for them when you go around and first take the roofs off, particularly if you do it during this colder weather. All right. Very first time I gave this talk, it was to a group in Londonderry, and I'd done it at short notice, didn't do my homework, and partway through, someone put their hand up and said, "Jed, do you realise there are no woodpeckers in Ireland?" Which I hadn't, and unfortunately, I'd done a large chunk on woodpeckers. Fortunately, I'm now reliably informed you both have the greatest spotted woodpecker you can see here, and the green woodpecker over on your side of the water. Now, I gather they aren't a problem to beekeepers yet, but hopefully with the number of people here, some of you are reasonably young, and in your lifetime, I am reasonably confident woodpeckers will become a problem. It is a learnt trait, a bit like great tits on milk bottles. It's something they teach their young as a food source in cold weather. Similarly, the woodpeckers generally at this time of year, they're ground feeding. If the ground is covered in snow or frozen hard, they can't get to their usual food source. And if they discover there's something in hives, they will annually go back to them in times of cold weather. Here you can see they've pecked a good hole in there, and there's all the sawdust chippings from the hole. And there's a patch I did from the previous year. Great big hole. I'll just comment here. These hives are made out of sterling board. They're homemade hives. One of my big adages about bee farming is you don't make money out of bee farming by spending it. Although I put a lot of effort into looking after the bees and everything, the hives are not so well looked after in themselves, and some of them are a grade above firewood, but the bees are very happy with them. This sterling board, I picked up 132 sheets of 8x4 sheets from Silverstone one year, second hand, and made up a lot of brood chambers out of it, along with nearly everything else on the farm is made out of sterling board because I had so much of it. And they worked out at making up these brood chambers, which even now the 14 by 12, which is the size I use, the brood chambers, even if you buy them in bulk, are somewhere 20 to 30 pounds each. So it's a really good saving. Here again, ground near the hives, little bits of polystyrene. Woodpeckers again, patched that with a bit of polyfiller. Big thing, woodpeckers and polystyrene, they absolutely love polystyrene. They can go through it in seconds. Unlike the wood, which it might take them several days before they make a noticeable hole. The polystyrene they will go through really quickly. So while the woodpeckers haven't paid any attention to your hives, make the most of your polystyrene ones, because once they discover them, they do become a problem. Big problem with them is they make a hole and other people get in. Here's a little vole that's got in, but rats and mice can get in through there, and they'll do a lot more damage to the actual bees and hives than the woodpeckers. They will actually find their own way in, and particularly rats will gnaw their way in if they can get in. And similarly, mice, if you don't put mouse guards on or do something with your entrances, can get in. And generally what they'll do is they'll build the nest against one wall of the hive, well away from where the cluster is, and they'll slowly chew away at the honey and stores that are in there, particularly on the colder days when the bees aren't wandering about. And what will happen is, as the colony starts to expand, suddenly they get to an area with no stores left because the rodents have had it. And unless you do something, they'll starve out. Here you can see signs of mice or something having a little chew trying to get in, and they can do it far more easily on the poly hives than they can on the wooden ones. We run everything with a narrow slot, which means we don't have to use mouse guards. We basically, everything we do is to save time and effort and equipment. So by running narrow slot entrances year round, we've saved entrance blocks, mouse guards, and the job of fiddling about, swapping them round. Here's one. Now this is bits of wax cappings chucked out. Not absolutely certain whether it's bees going through the stores or possible late robbing from wasps, which I didn't spot, and the bees have had a tidy up and chuck the rubbish out, or they've had a clean up, or most likely a rodent. Here it's far more obvious. They've widened that bit of the entrance just enough to squeeze in. They've been eating at the stores, chucked the cappings out, and they've been dragging leaves in to build a nest. And sure enough, when we went in there, there was a nest in the corner. We emptied it all out and we tidied up the entrance. Right, here's my emergency kit that I take round with me. It's a tube of sealant. This is roof gutter sealant because it's waterproof, works really well, very sticky, bit messy. If you've got a bee suit that you're very proud of, make sure you take a cloth to wipe your fingers on and equipment on, because it's very difficult to wash off anything you put it on. We've got a sheet of aluminium, thin aluminium there. These are actual old printers sheets. I picked up a lot of them from one of my local printers. They sold them off for scrap. I got several hundred of them for £15. They are big enough to make metal covers for roofs as well, which was the primary purpose I bought them for. But they're great for patching up hives. Tin snips to cut them up. You can use a strong pair of scissors on this, but if you get anything thicker, you will need the snips. And that's a heavy duty stapler to staple any repairs in place. Here we are. Mice have had a go and they gnawed a big hole there, and we've just taped a little bit to block over there. Here, this is a bit of patching with the gutter mastic. It's shrunk a bit, and this is just prior to me redoing it. These can be temporary repairs, and when you get to the summer, you can swap the brood chamber over, take it home and tidy it up properly. Well, like me, if we do the repair well enough, the hives aren't that higher quality or got a bit of age to them, we would just tidy up this repair because we know this hive's on its last legs anyway, rather than putting a lot of effort into repairing it properly. but it's your choice. One thing we do is we're reactive rather than preventative. As I say, the woodpeckers, it's a learnt trait. And although we've got woodpeckers on every single site where we keep bees, we hear them quite often. There's only a few sites where the woodpeckers know that there's something in those funny wooden boxes. And if we have a long spell of cold weather, I'll go around those few sites, see if there's any problems. If there are, I'll then net the hives. Just ordinary chicken netting, or make sure it's small mesh, because if it's big holes, it's really good for the woodpeckers to get a decent grip on and hammer a really big hole through the hole in the mesh. So you've defeated the object of the exercise. The other thing you can do is you can get old CDs. If you've got grandchildren or teenage children and you're not very keen on some of the music they're listening to, take their CDs away as an emergency measure for your bees. Hang them up on string from trees or on bamboo canes near the hives. Woodpeckers are very timid and it often scares them away. So we will do this only when we know there's a particular year with a problem, because it's a lot of extra work. We do use polynukes a lot. I do like them, and they are very prone to woodpeckers. So we actually just put a sheet, this is corrugated sheeting over the top, and then we wrap the whole lot rather than trying to wrap them individually. Still a bit of a faff, and our preferred option is this. This is an old BT van back, or O2 as they're now, no, OpenReach they're now called. You can see their old logo there. Took it off there. I've just stick it on a trailer for winter and drag it out to a site. You can see little bits of tube. That's inch water pipe, the blue alkathene plastic water pipe that you get nowadays. And that I've paid a child very little money to paint little hieroglyphics on there to help bee orientation. And then inside, we've got lots of polynukes. I use Payne's polynukes. They actually have a hole that's exactly the same size as the inch water pipe, so it works perfectly with that. It is the same size as 22mm copper pipe, but if you use a metal pipe, because of the time of year you're using it, it will tend to be very cold, and so the bees will be reluctant to walk along it. Using a plastic one, they're more likely to walk along it and go out into the sun. In here, the primary reason I do it is to shelter them, protect them from woodpeckers. But it also has the added advantage is it keeps them out of the wind. These have the ventilated floors in them, and you can see these ones here, ventilated floors, mesh floors, and the drosses dropping out and collecting here. If I was so inclined, I could pick that up and analyze it for varroa mites to see what sort of mite drop I'm getting, and see what the varroa levels are. These are, there's some national nukes there. As I say, we use 14x12 hives, so most of the nukes are 14x12 for us. There are some years, and not this year, where we actually make up overwintered nukes for sale in the spring when we've got spare queens. And those up here, we've got some Apodea mini mating nukes with supers on, and we're basically overwintering queens that were mated in August the previous year, so that we've got spares for our own use coming through winter. The other thing is, when you go into this, you always notice it's warmer than outside. It's got a translucent roof, so it gets a bit of heat from the sun. Excuse me, that's just too much talking, nothing ominous. And all these hives in here also generate their own heat, and it has its own little microclimate, which helps this lot develop better and quicker in the spring. And this is one of the main reasons I choose my winter sites for early pollen. It's really, really helpful to get the bees going early in the spring, just like us. Fresh food's better than stored processed food. So they prefer fresh pollen if they can get it. And also the fact that they're getting it in stimulates them into rearing more brood. Most hives will have stored pollen underneath the honey stores in the frame, so they will survive anyway. But having new pollen really gives them a good boost in the spring. So all my winter sites are chosen for shelter, and secondly, for a good source of early pollen. And that wants to be pretty close to where the hives are. Here, this is a waste area where the farmer actually, obviously, historically, has either dug up a load of garden and dumped it here, or chucked old leftover bulbs out here, because there's a great range, a load of snowdrops have expanded over the area recently, along with crocuses, and that I think is a very early daffodil just trying to come out. So it has crocuses and snowdrops, which the bees do like. They'll go in there. It just gives them something, and the fact that they're getting something new into the hive stimulates and revitalizes the whole hive and helps them get going early in the year. Here they are on the crocuses. If you're in a town or village, this isn't so much of an issue, because usually a lot of people in their gardens, obviously gardeners, like to have flowers and keep their gardens looking good all year round. So most villages and small towns, suburbia, will have gardens nearby which have plenty of different variety of sources of pollen for the bees. We're out in the countryside. We also tend to have sites of usually 12 hives at a time, and we aren't that near villages usually, so we do have to actually source areas where there is a good lot of pollen. Going back a few years when there was a lot of foot and mouth, a friend of mine had a system where he used to overwinter a lot of his hives in old quarries and big blocks of 200 to 300 hives, and he'd always take them out in the spring to their spring sites. With foot and mouth he couldn't, and there was a lady who lived nearby complained that she couldn't see the crocuses in her window box for bees. All these hives were trying to get the little bit of pollen from these one lot of window boxes, were the only source in the whole area. So do have a think about that, particularly if you've got the bees away from other houses. Here, this was just taken the other day. The hazel there is just about to come into flower, and a lot of the catkin based trees do tend to flower earlier in the year rather than later in the year. So hazel's usually the first one. As I say, this was taken the other day. I suspect today was quite a warm day here, and it wouldn't, I think if I'd managed to get out, I'd have seen bees on it. But you can see, oh, sorry, moved the wrong button. There's a lot of hazel in this newly planted area of woodland. A lot of farms, particularly around here, they're still using the woodland grant scheme to basically plant up areas which aren't much good for farming. They get paid to do it under the woodland grant scheme. So you still find areas of relatively young woodland, so they get plenty of sun. They're sheltered anyway, and not only have they got the hazel in there, there's a lot of other flowers and plants there to keep them going as well. Again, you can see the odd bit of patching from woodpecker, historic woodpecker damage. This is older. Again, another catkin one that will be coming out later on. Similar time of year to when poplars flower, and the bees work them quite well. You can see there's just a bit of pollen on that bee's leg there. So they are getting the pollen in, and they do like working it, and go out on a sunny day. And I found that if I pick the right day, I can find pollen coming into the hives in every single month of the year. And I'm not planting plants especially for the bees or anything like that. There are plants that yield pollen every single month of the year, and obviously it's very easy to supplement the feeding of the bees with syrup in the autumn, and so on. But pollen, you can use pollen substitutes. You can buy pollen patties and things, but I've tried them historically, and the bees aren't that keen on them. It could be partly because they've got good sources of pollen anyway, so we'll always go for the natural rather than the substitute. But I know years ago you could buy a pollen supplement as a powder that you mixed up with sugar and made a paste for the bees, wrapped it in cling film, put it on the hives, a bit like the fondant sugar that you put on the hives. I found that actually worked better by going to the hive, opening it up, pulling the comb that the queen hasn't started laying on, and you'll see that the bees have cleared all the cells, emptied them, ready for the queen to lay in them, and you could rub the powder directly into the frame, and within a few hours, if you went back and looked at that, the bees would have packed it down as if it was real pollen. So a really good way of feeding that pollen substitute. But as I say, I prefer real pollen, so haven't used any substitute. Well, I have tried a few substitutes that have been given to me by suppliers who hoped I'd buy a lot of them. And as I say, I found them disappointing, and the bees just haven't really taken them. Other thing we'll do, we're talking about feeding the bees and encouraging them. Here we are, we've got a bit later in the year. This is most likely to be a warmish February day. It's not that warm because that's a quilted boiler suit to keep me warm. So it will have been comfortably below 10 degrees. The grimace on the face is to give an indication of weight. This is hefting hives. Now hefting hives, lifting them to assess the weight. It is something you can do which works pretty well if you've got several hives, because you can spot an odd one out. If you go along a line, you can find ones that are either heavy or light or whatever. But that could partly be to the design of hives. Some of mine, these sterling board ones, are heavier than the cedar ones, so have to make an allowance for that. But if you've only got one or two hives, it is very difficult to make a good judgment, because when you lift them, you're not sure if one's really light or one's really heavy, or they're both okay and one's got a little bit more stores than the others, or are they both light? It could be down to a lack of Weetabix in the morning and you've just misjudging it. So it's something that, if in doubt, use scales and write it down. I do it because I've usually got at least 12 hives on site. Here I found one that's been robbed out and just put it on the truck, and there's the stand sitting empty, and I'm just going along the rest to see how they're doing. If in doubt, it doesn't matter what time of year it is. I've taken the tops off hives in Finland in deep snow. So long as you don't do it for a long time, just to have a quick look in, you're not going to really harm the colony, unless it's actually pouring down with rain or snowing very heavily. You're going to do very little damage to them other than give them a quick burst of cold air. Have a look in, see how the bees are looking. And this is, you've hefted it and you aren't sure. This one looks fine. The other frames, there's honey in this frame, and there were honey in all the other frames as well. This hive was light, and it's because the queen started laying. The hive's doing really well. You can see great big cluster there. These are 14 by 12 frames, remember. So she'll be laying on 1, 2, 3, at least 4 frames there, which is the equivalent of 6 frames in a national hive. So that's really good for early in the year. But what it does mean, and these frames are virtually empty, there's a bit of stores in there. This colony is going to run out of food if nothing's done. Equally, you can go in hives like the previous one and the bees are down below the frames. That's an indication. And I'm using words like indication, usually, generally. These are to cover me, because most of beekeeping is a generalization. Bees usually never, always, um, never, um, don't or do things. They generally do it, and they're always ones that break the rules. And it also to cover me so you can't say, well, Jed said, because I'll have said, I definitely said generally or maybe or usually. Anyway, this one's, it's light, lots of bees in it. It's light because they've used up a lot of stores and they're producing brood. So it needs feeding. We do leave the queen excluders on in winter because it's another job to take them all in, clean them all up and put them back on the hives and something to store. And there's a small risk of spreading disease between hives if you haven't put the same excluder back on its original hive, assuming you haven't actually cleaned and sterilized it when you took it home. So partly because we find it doesn't harm the hive at all, whether they're framed or they're just straight flat excluders. We've never had problems with bees not being able to get from one end of the hive to the other. So we always leave them on over winter. So we put it back down there. We can see where the cluster is. It's in this top corner. Our crown boards are such that they've got offset holes in them. These are ones we've made up ourselves. We don't use porter bee escapes, so we just drill simple holes on the diagonal, which means we can spin it round so that one hole is over where the bees are. This is coming back a bit later on, and already the bees have started eating the fondant. Historically, you'll see it shortly, we used to buy in baker's fondant, which is big boxes that were used commercially by bakeries for fondant icing, the icing that you can roll out, put over a cake, and it'll harden. And that works pretty well for feeding the bees. It does, if you're not careful, it will go hard before they eat it. Nowadays, there's commercial suppliers of fondant specifically made for bees. It comes usually in polythene sealed bags. All we do is we cut a D-shaped slot in one side and peel that back. Sorry, we'll go backwards. Peel that back and put the exposed fondant on top of the hole which is over the cluster. If it's a small colony and needs feeding, it could be worth pulling the queen excluder out, either sticking it to one side, taking it home, or leaving it on top of this slot but under the roof so you know where it is. Because it is metal, it will produce a bit of a cold barrier which will reduce the chances of the bees going through it for the fondant. If it's a strong colony, they'll be producing enough warmth that that won't be an issue and they'll get up and get to the fondant. Big thing with the fondant is if the bees need it and want it, they'll take it. If they don't need it, they generally will not touch it, which means you can put it on when you think they might need it, because you can always take it off again, pull that D-shaped slit you've cut, put it back over and take it away and use it later on. If the colony dies out or seems to have a problem or something, or could potentially have a disease, you're always best removing the fondant that's been in contact with the bees and disposing of it before you take the rest of the fondant away, because there is a slight risk that you could spread disease if you took it to another colony. The big thing with fondant is once you start feeding it, you've got to keep feeding it until the honey flow starts. By giving them fondant, you've created an artificial honey flow and you're stimulating the bees into believing that there's an external source of nectar available. So they will disproportionately increase their brood rearing to try and maximize this potential crop they think is there. If it suddenly stops, i.e. you run out of fondant and you don't put more on, they'll still be rearing brood at a rate that they cannot feed, because they're no longer getting this massive source of food that you're providing, and they will starve out. And they're more likely to starve out if you start feeding them and stop than if you never started feeding them in the first place. So do keep going until the honey flow starts. Here, we've got to the stage where the colony's got so strong. This is where the fondant pate was, and they've put comb inside the plastic bag. So we've had to take that off, and the colony needs more space, otherwise they wouldn't have done that. And this is the same thing that we use for going to Kent. This is actually using the old baker's fondant. We get a frame from a super, and we do have frames that have had the wax removed, either for cut comb or because they've been cut out because it was honey that had started setting because it had too much oilseed rape in it or whatever. And we put that frame above the excluder, directly above where the cluster is on the hive, with a slab of fondant in it. And this enables us to continue feeding fondant. The alternative would be to put it on top of the super, but you've got a great big gap between where the bees are and the crown board, putting it here, that if the weather goes cold on you, it's still directly in touch with the bees. Usually, if you get it right, they'll finish that, draw that comb and start putting honey in it. Sometimes, if the honey flow starts before they've finished the fondant, you've got to go in there and take the fondant out, because once you've got the honey flow, they won't touch the fondant and it'll just end up there as a lump in amongst one of your frames. So do be wary of that if you're using this method. Again, in the spring, once the weather improves, bees start flying well, bringing in pollen, they'll have a tidy up, and you can get quite a lot of dead bees outside the front of the hive, particularly if there's been mice in there or something's happened to the hive, a bit of isolation, starvation or something. That's where the queens moved in one direction and some of the bees got left behind, weather got cold and they failed to move with the rest of the colony. So you usually got chilled. Bees have had a tidy up, and you can get quite a lot of bees chucked out in the spring, and it can be alarming. With this sort of number, I definitely have a good look at that colony as soon as the weather's good enough to see if there's any signs of disease or other problems, because that's quite a lot to have. But on occasions, it could be just a big, strong colony having a massive tidy up and nothing to worry about. But it is a warning sign to check that you are definitely comfortable with what's going on in there. Here, later on, once we get sort of to March time, you can use frame feeders. I made wooden frame feeders, did them all perfectly. They worked all right first year, and then they started leaking. Trying to reseal them's a pain. Very simple method is get the big polythene bags. You can get them from Lakeland Plastics. Other suppliers are available. Stick a plastic bag in there, few twigs and straw, whatever, so the bees can climb up easily, and feed them with that. Big advantage of that is when you finish with it on that hive, you can pull that bag out and dispose of it. Any dead bees or dross or rubbish in there is got rid of, and you've effectively cleaned the inside of the feeder by putting a new bag in there. We tend not to use syrup in the early part of the year, because unlike fondant, if there's syrup there, the bees generally will take it regardless, whereas the fondant they'll only take if they need it. So you get you can artificially overcrowd the honey with syrup just before a honey flow, and you run the risk of syrup ending up in your honey. All right, with hives, you do get hives, you go into them. As I say, we will look in the hive. If the bees are flying, you can have a look in the hive. If they're flying reasonably well, you can start pulling frames out quickly. You're not going to spend half an hour. You're ideally going to spend 2 or 3 minutes maximum, just going in quickly to suss out what's happening. And either this one, the queen had failed, and we got rid of her. We colony was perfectly healthy otherwise, apart from the queen failure. We didn't have spare queens at the time. So all we've done is we've taken the roof off this hive, crown board and excluder still in place, and we've just newspaper united it with this queen-right colony. It's got plenty of stores in and bees in, and all we'll do is we'll use that to split or make up another hive later in the season. But it gives us those bees that would have been lost had we done nothing. You do have to be certain that there isn't any disease problem, because this would be a great way of introducing disease from that colony into this one. Again, we do quick checks of hives, as I say, this time of year. If there's anything suspect, we'll mark it. And usually we put a stone on top of the hive to mark it, and often scribble something on the hive so we know why we put it there. There are many times where we go back there and there's a stone on top of the hive and we can't remember why on earth we put it there, but we know there's something sus with that hive. Lots of ways round it. Where are we? Yeah. Anything in doubt, anything that dies out over winter, and particularly if you've got frames with lots of dead bees in them, you're not going to be able to get them out easily. You don't know if they've died out from a problem or anything. Just burn it all rather than risk spreading disease around the hives. This is the combs I'm talking about. The hive itself you can sterilize with burning, or there's other ways of sterilizing the poly hives with I've gone blank on that, but check with other people on how to sterilize the poly hives. I don't use them, so we don't very much, so we don't have too much of an issue of that. Right. The other thing, as soon as the weather gets good enough, we will do spring inspections. Now, there we're actually going in, we're going to go into the hive properly. It's usually before we put the first supers on, and we'll be going in there and we'll go through the whole colony. Any old combs that the bees have cleaned out and they're a bit ropey, we'll pull them out to replace them and put foundation in the back of the hive to replace them. We'll look to check that the queen's laying well with a good pattern and everything's good. And we're also looking closely at the frames of brood for any signs of disease. Anything with disease, if it's something dramatic, we'll get the foul brood inspector in. If it's bad and we don't know what it is, or if it's sort of really bad sac brood or something like that, we'll most likely just get rid of the colony rather than trying to nurse it back to health, because invariably that problem will recur again later on. And you're running the risk of spreading it through the colonies. Now, equally, we then have a thorough look, and also once we start putting the supers on, we'll keep an eye on them. Any colonies like this big one here, this one's expanded really rapidly, and we know that if they expand really rapidly, and it's most likely partially because we've been feeding them a lot of pollen, fondant, sugar fondant substitute to encourage them and help them through winter. It's artificially inspired them to lay more, so the queen's built up, the whole colony's built up, and we know they're going to swarm if we don't do something to mitigate that. So what we've done there is take a frame of brood out of that colony, and we've stuck an extra empty super on above the crown board, so that if they need it, the bees can get through the holes in the crown board to that super. Now that frame we've taken out, we'll actually take it away and we'd use it for our queen rearing. And we will, even on the first inspection, if we've got strong hives, we'll start be taking frames of sealed brood out, because that is going to have the maximum effect on reducing the colony size, a frame of sealed brood, because if that emerges, it's going to give you another 2,000 bees in there straight away. If we take it away, it's going to take them several weeks to replace that frame before there's any brood hatching from it. So we take it away to reduce the number of bees in there. If we found the queen, we'll take it away with bees on. We'll use it for our queen rearing hives because we make double brooded hives up from hives like these that we've taken lots of frames of brood from, just to boost them early in the year for the queen rearing. The alternative is to add that frame to another hive. You are absolutely certain you've done all your checks on this hive that it's good, fit and healthy. Otherwise you would not put that frame in another hive. And this is where I usually ask a question to the audience, but I'll tell you the answer because you can't answer now. Is over here we've got weak hive and two reasonable hives. Which hive do we put it in? We could put it in the weak hive so that all the hives are nearly the same, but that's the wrong answer. If you put it in the mediocre hive, it's going to get up to good strength and therefore honey production strength a lot quicker than putting it in the weak hive. So you're going to gain far more by putting it in there. The other big thing is that weak hive could be weak for a reason that you can't spot. It might have a subclinical disease in there. Basically something you can't see, but it's holding the colony back and there are no visible signs of it. So by putting a frame of brood in there, you'll give it a bit of a boost and you'll actually help encourage the disease and problem in there more than likely. And therefore you're giving yourself a bigger problem than you had already. Any very weak hives, keep an eye on them and just see what they do. Once they start developing naturally themselves and they all look healthy, you're okay. But we're very wary of actually trying to artificially boost them, particularly this time of year. So one thing we will do, we bring hives home there where there's colonies that have died out or hives that we've got in storage. We've patched this one up. You can see the remains of my untidy gluing there. We've got a couple of frames of comb which have come out of hives that have either died out or they're surplus to requirement in the hives, but they've definitely come from hives that haven't got disease problems. I keep saying this because it's really easy to spread disease, but if you know your diseases and are careful, you can do an awful lot of things with these combs and they don't go to waste. These are two full drawn out combs there and there. That is a frame with no wax foundation or anything in it, and it's put between these two combs, and this is what we use as bait hives. It's got a very bee friendly smell, and we have at least one of these somewhere in every apiary we have, and several at home. They work well as bait hives. They do attract swarms every year, but you could make them up all with drawn comb. Big problem there is if you don't get a swarm in there, you'll almost certainly get wax moth in there and they'll make a horrible mess. By having that empty frame between the two drawn frames, the wax moth doesn't like open airy space, so tends not to attack these combs so they don't get damaged. You can use swarm lures. They cost money, therefore I don't use them. The other problem with them is the swarm lures are very effective. One of the things you can use a bait hive for in an apiary is when you go to the apiary, look at the bait hive. If there are no bees flying around it, there's a reasonable chance that there's nothing about to swarm in your apiary. If you've got a good swarm lure in there, they'll have bees flying around that bait hive all the time because that scent is so strong. It just attracts bees all the time, and they'll go in out of curiosity rather than looking for a new site. If you go to the site and there's bees flying around your bait hive, you've almost certainly got a colony of bees nearby about to swarm. It might not necessarily be yours in that yard, but there is one somewhere. If you've got a lot of bees flying around it and some of them have got pollen on your legs, or on their legs, you're too late. There's already a swarm in there which you've caught and you've got to find where it came from. Anyway, this is a job you can do before the season gets going and everything gets really busy. Here we are again, another catkin plant. This is pussy willow, the first of the willows. There are lots of varieties of willows, and the pussy willow and goat willow are the two that flower first. And they have the grey furry buds, whereas the others tend to have different coloured ones, some of them. Once I see bees on the pussy willow and I hear my first cuckoo, I regard that as the end of winter. And if I've got bees alive then, I believe I can keep them alive for the rest of the season. So that's when I regard winter as over. So that is the end. Or is it just the beginning of the beekeeping summer? Thank you. I'll now hand over to John, who is going to skillfully manage the questions for me.
Jed, thank you very much indeed. I think that was really very, very interesting and full of practical tips. And I think indeed one of the last ones there, which I did take, was the how you use bait hives and how you could use bait hives with the lure round the apiary. Very interesting indeed. Also, just noticing, in fact, is that you use pallets really for stands, and certainly that makes it very practical, very easy to move around. Anyway, we've had really an extremely good audience this evening, and I would just like to say that this lecture was in fact sponsored by Northern Bee Books from Yorkshire. For those of you who know of Northern Bee Books, you'll know that they are probably the world's biggest English-speaking bee book suppliers. And I'm very grateful to Northern Bee Books for sponsoring this particular lecture. And I think we will certainly, I think initially go over, before we do the questions and answers, to a small advert, a small video from Northern Bee Books, which we'll just hear shortly.
Hello! Northern Bee Books has the largest range of English language beekeeping books in the world. We also publish 2 separate magazines for beekeepers. The Beekeepers Quarterly is a global beekeeping magazine and has a strong team of correspondents from all over the world. Our contributors have specialised knowledge on particular aspects of beekeeping, drawn largely from their own experiences, and include both amateur and commercial beekeepers, scientists and representatives of organisations that have an interest in beekeeping as a craft or industry. Natural Bee Husbandry magazine is an international journal for bee-centred beekeeping. This magazine will be of special interest to beekeepers who have moved away from their beekeeping colonies in conventional ways, or who prefer to keep their bees kept in hives more suited to the bees' needs, rather than for the beekeeper's ease of management. Both magazines are published 4 times a year and are available on our website. To look at these and our full catalogue of new and second-hand bee books, visit northernbeebooks.co.uk.
We've got quite a number of questions here.
John, can I just ask, there is quite a lot. I will give relatively short answers. People can come back and we might be able to expand later on if we've got time, yeah?
Right, okay. There were some actually asked on the chat room, so I can very quickly do those first. And whoops, sorry, I've lost. Here we go. If we do these, oh, right, hold on, I'm getting a little bit lost there. They're coming in thick and fast here. Just 1 second. Yeah, just said, out of interest, what thickness of sterling board do you use?
Fortunately, it was 18 mil, so just about the right size, which was the appeal of it when it came up on offer.
That's right. I think it was also asked, somebody missed out the cost per
yeah,
hive.
It worked out for the sterling board 50p for the sterling board, and I got someone to make up the locking bars, national locking bars, for 150 for the 2 pairs you need to make the hive up. So they worked out at £2 a box.
Right. Do you treat your bees early in January for Varroa? That's from Martin.
Yeah, Martin, I do a single Varroa treatment late summer with one of the proprietary strip treatments. Did use Apistan, which was my favorite, while the Varroa didn't have resistance to it. I tried various other ones and have currently gone over to the Apivar, which is the Amatraz based one that has just come out the last year or so. But that's just one treatment. So historically, I have used oxalic acid, acetic acid, and usually do that between Christmas and January if I think I've got a problem. But I only did that 2 winters once I started managing the Varroa better anyway, by getting the strips in earlier.
All right. So you're using acetic acid rather than oxalic.
Sorry, no, I meant oxalic.
Oh, right.
Oxalic, a dribble fed. If I had to use another one, I'd most likely go over to a sublimator with the acetic acid, but I haven't, so I haven't got into that at all yet.
Okay, from Brian, is there an issue of roof sealant being toxic to bees?
I haven't noticed it. They can get stuck in it because it's very gooey, but usually the time of year I'm putting it in on the hives, the bees are very tightly clustered, don't come near it. So we just stick it on, and I haven't noticed any mortality from it, but I put my hands up. I haven't actually checked that at all, but there are lots of varieties available, and a lot of them are no longer solvent based, so they're less likely to be a problem. But it's nothing I've ever seen a problem with, and I know others who use the same system.
Okay, so Emer saying, good evening. Have the queens come into lay yet, or will it be a few more weeks? And Emer's living in Ireland.
Well, to be honest, I don't know about mine or yours. I haven't had a look, but I'd expect a little bit of brood in some of them, definitely. I know I did. You saw the polyneuks in the cabin. The other day when I looked at them, what I do with them is I take the roof off and they just have a clear perspex sheet, and you can put your hand over where the cluster is. And I definitely could feel a fair amount of warmth there. So I suspect they're definitely got a bit of brood in. So I suspect the colonies have as well.
Right. I think Megan and Gary have come to your aid about, because I think you're struggling to find how you sterilize polyhives. Megan's saying bleach, and then Gary is saying caustic soda. And I think probably the caustic soda is probably from oven cleaner.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could buy caustic soda quite readily over the internet. We use it for cleaning our apodias. You've reminded me exactly what I use now, because we clean all the mini nukes with it. We dip them in boiling caustic soda very quickly. You've got to be careful if you've got plastic bits in there, because they'll warp and distort with the heat. And then we put them in a big vat of cold water to rinse it off and let them dry out thoroughly.
What concentration of caustic soda would you use, Jed? You remember?
About that much.
Okay, no, just so
so that you can smell it. I'm sure. I'm
careful with.
I'm sure there's a recommended amount, but we have a continuous system, and we just keep topping it and the water up. We use an old Burco boiler to keep it going, and we're doing 700 in one hit. So we end up with a fair bit of water evaporating or getting carried off with the nukes. And so we're having to top it up. And we use about, I think, a 500 gram bottle will do the 700 mini nukes.
All right, okay. It gives some idea, right?
But be careful, wear rubber gloves and things, because it's not only is it boiling, but it's obviously caustic. There's a clue in the name. So we'll burn you in 2 ways if you get it on you.
Okay, Martin is asking, could you expand on serializing the polyhives? I'm not quite sure what that means. Whether it's
sterilizing the polyhive.
I think that should be sterilizing.
Serializing.
Yeah, well,
so one on top of the other, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, I do it with boiling caustic soda, but you've got to. The Burco boiler works great for mini nukes. If you're using actual hives, you need some sort of good, ideally stainless container. When the big commercial beekeepers either buy a proprietary boiler or you can do it outside with a decent container and actually light a fire or use a gas underneath it. But it does really want to be boiling or very hot, so that you actually melt the wax and propolis and get that out of there, because the wax can hold some of the disease as well.
Right.
I don't know, can you do it with cold caustic soda? I've never done it.
Right, okay, not sure. What do you think about limited quantity syrup feed in February to stimulate brood rearing, followed by bee protein powder in early March?
As I mentioned, I don't use any of the protein powders or pollen substitutes.
Okay.
It's all a bit of extra faff. If you've got the bees on a good location and they're looked after, they shouldn't really need it. Again, personally, I don't take any protein or vitamin supplements because I believe I have a reasonable diet, and a lot of people survived without them for years. Syrup does work to stimulate the bees, but as I say, they will take a lot of it, and they can take too much of it if you're not careful. If you're stimulating them, you've got to make sure that they've got plenty of stores to keep them going until the honey flow starts, which at the time you're feeding, you don't know if that's 2 weeks or 2 months away. So it's a more expensive way of feeding them. If you're using top feeders or anything, it's difficult for the bees to get at it if the weather's particularly cold. And if they started brood rearing, they're wanting to keep that brood nest really warm, which means they need to use a lot of stores, so they need to get at it. With the fondant put directly over the bees, it's far more accessible, because the real problem is in that cold weather when they really need the feed to keep them warm and keep everything going. So I'm not so keen on feeding syrup too early. There is a thing about putting the fondant directly over the frames. You can do that if you've got an eco or something, but our way means we don't need extra equipment. We don't spend money when we don't need to. So we put the fondant over the feed hole. A good lot of bees can get in there, and once they're feeding and they're eating away that area of fondant, they've got a big area of fondant where they've made a hole in the in the fondant to feed through. Yes, they've got a small initial entrance to it, but they increase the surface area they can feed from as they eat through the pack.
Right. From Alan, do you move weak colonies into nooks or leave them in the full size hive?
Generally, again, because it's less work, I move them in the full size hives. However, a few years ago, we had the beast from the east. I think it was spring of 2013. If I ever had a situation like that again, particularly where you get into sort of March time, the colony's building up and lots of brood in there. If there was a weak colony that was small enough to put into a polynuke, I would, because I think they'd benefit from that and keep them wrapped up if the weather's particularly cold. But once the weather picks up and they're flying reasonably well, I don't think it makes too much difference. Then, because it was a small colony and they do want building up, that's somewhere where I'd put a frame feeder in, keep them compact using the frame feeder sort of as a dummy board, and feed them syrup heavily, adding frames of foundation as they expanded in order to build them up. So that's an exception to my normal practice of just fondant. And I'd do that in a full colony. But yes, I'd put them in nukes if the weather's particularly bad and they're a small lot. Yes.
Okay, from Sally, where would you expect the bees to be in a double brood box at the moment? I presume they mean on the bottom box or the top box.
I don't know. It depends how it was set up, when it was set up, condition of the bees when they started. There was another question I spotted about the bees being near the top or down low in the box. It just depends how much stores they've got in there, and really partially where they started winter. If they've got lots and lots of stores in there, they're more likely to be at the bottom with all the stores above them, because it's easier to warm the stores and then get the honey out of the stores if it's got a bit of heat to it. Once the bees are up on the top bars, it's difficult for them to go downwards into the cold to get honey from the stored boxes. Really, you have to have a look. It depends how you've managed your bees, and if they're a smallish lot and you were feeding them heavily towards the back end, they're more likely to store the surplus honey above them, so compress themselves into the bottom of the two boxes. If they're a really strong colony, they could have been already in the two boxes going into winter and might well be in the top box with a lot of food underneath. It's you'll have to have a look and sort of work out why they are where they are, and it'll be partly down to your management. I don't use double brood boxed hives as a rule, because we've got the big 14 by 12 hives. We do use them for the queen rearing, but the top box is always above an excluder for the queen rearing, so it's an artificial situation.
Right. Okay. There was one just again, some from Anonymous. You were about to tell us the significance of finding the cluster deeper within the hive, i.e., barely visible from above.
I've half covered that. That's usually a sign that they've got plenty of stores in there, and they're down well below the stores. So if you can't see them from the top, and often if we've got a hive where we can't see the bees, we'll give it a gentle kick and put our ear close to the top of the frames to see if we can hear them deep down in the box. Yes, you've got to be a little bit careful. If you've got edgy bees and it's a warm day, you'll definitely know they're there. But if you do it right, you'll hear a gentle hum from the fact that you've tapped the hive.
Right. I'm just going to give a few more questions here. Unfortunately, there's a whole pile of them here.
Right.
But,
I'll try and do short answers then.
Oh, I know, but I think in time we've gone on for quite a long time here. But this is from James. He says, how do you know your Varroa count when you're using solid floors?
I don't is the answer. Basically, we treat prophylactically. We treat everything every year. We don't know the Varroa levels. We do look out in the autumn if we're starting to get signs of deformed wing virus or anything like that. We do have a look round. Usually, if it's a bad year for Varroa, which is usually caused by the season starting early, therefore the Varroa having a long season to develop and build their numbers up, we'll usually start seeing mites on bees when we do our end of summer inspection in sort of August time. And we know we've got to keep an eye on things if we're starting to see mites on bees there, but we don't do any knockdown checks or anything like that. We've got a system that works so far. I'm touching wood at the moment. We, as I say, we've got a lot of hives, so we treat prophylactically. Everything gets treated regardless. And to date, we've kept the Varroa levels nicely low, and we're getting the performance out of the bees without too many problems.
Right. I think actually, really, Jed, I think we'll maybe have to draw this to a close. There's a whole plethora of questions here, and I think what we could do is we could, whether you want to maybe answer, you could maybe send the people an email or quick email or whatever. But I think I will actually just ask one more question. It's from Andrew, and he says, when and how do you get the bees to draw fresh comb?
When usually the weather's got to be pretty good to get them to really draw the comb. We mentioned the thing about using drawn comb in that weak colony instead of putting it into the nuke, but the bees have got to be flying well, the temperature's got to be up, and the colony needs a bit of strength to it to really draw comb. So it's more dependent on the weather and the strength of the colony. We will put comb in there. When we do that first inspection, if we've pulled out ropey old combs, we'll stick frames of foundation in there so that we know it's there if they need it, and it saves us actually running out when we come back next time. What we will do is, once the weather's picking up, and you'll see it because the bees will be building wax on the old frames where they're storing honey, or if you've got supers on, you'll see them building wax in the supers. We will then put that foundation, sort of, usually you'll get the brood on several frames. You'll have a frame of lots of pollen and stores, and then a frame of stores, and we'll put the frame of foundation next to that. And we'll also use that so that we'll pull any old combs that the bees aren't actually got brood on and put them to the edge of the box at the beginning of the season in order to cycle them out of the system and get them changed over. But it's a very difficult one to sort of give a precise answer to, because it just depends on the conditions.
Right. Well, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I think we really have run on quite a while. I'm afraid, unfortunately, we can't get through all the questions that have been posted. So we will do our best maybe to get to answer some of these and be able to send some answer to you as best we can. Anyway, on your behalf.
Yeah, John, thinking of this, will I still be able to access these questions? Because it does give an option of typing answers. I don't. Right. My goodness, there are a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly possible we'll be able to retain this, all right, Jed. And I think it says we could type an answer, but you could be there for quite a while.
Yeah, no, yeah. I've just realised that, opening my big mouth.
Right. I think it's certainly possible what we could do, say, is we could go through and see there may be some questions here you've already answered. We could maybe try and see if we could pre-say them in some way and see if you can answer them. Would that be okay?
Yeah. The answers won't be as comprehensive as I've just given.
Right. Right. Right.
I don't like typing, which is why there's hardly any notes written on my slides.
Yeah.
John, could I just butt in for one moment?
Yes,
just to say, there was a comment from Megan: washing soda for most beekeepers, please, not caustic. I think that's sort of a health and safety advice. Jed obviously has years of experience with lots of hives under his belts, but it's worth mentioning.
I appreciate that. I mean, you do have to be careful with these things. Megan's right. I always respect anything she says. It's not something I've used. We've used caustic. We've used it carefully, but it is. We want to go for a big hit quickly. We're doing it very quickly, so their contact time comes into effectiveness as well. So yes, any other advice to protect beekeepers, please chip in and add it to the list.
Right. Well, I think that's certainly what we could do is we try and record the questions, and if you're able to give to make some reply, even a very short type, then maybe that might be the best way of approaching this. Okay. Again, I'd just like to thank you very, very much indeed, Jed. That was an extremely informative and very practical talk, and I think we'll be looking forward to your next talk, which will be on swarm control. So again, thank you very, very much indeed, and I'd like to wish all our audience to thank you for listening in, and look forward to our next webinar. So I all bid you good night. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.